afternoon. Welcome to the Labor Forum. You tuned in to WRFG 89.3 FM in Atlanta. My name is Diane Mathowitz. I'm a retired auto worker, co-host of this program, along with Paul McLennan, who's seated next to me. He's a retired MARTA worker, member of the Transit Workers Union. Hi, Paul.
Happy New Year.
Right, unbelievable, huh? Here we are, first program of 2016. I don't know how long it'll take you all out there to get used to writing 2016, not 2015 on your checks or whatever. Always takes me a little while. But I'm looking forward to this year. I think that there are so many good developments that are taking place among working class people, not just in this country but around the world. So I know that we're going to have lots to talk about, lots to report, many interesting and exciting new leaders to interview. I want to remind our listeners that the opinions that are expressed on the Labor Forum may not necessarily be those of the board of WRFG, its staff or volunteers. And I want to welcome anyone who's watching us on the Labor Forum YouTube channel. We really appreciate you tuning in and subscribing to the Labor Forum YouTube channel. It does mean that you are always able to go to that YouTube channel and watch past programs. You can see them and you also can get an audio copy of them there. So if there's something that you maybe didn't quite catch all of or missed a little part of, you always can go there. And of course, we have all the other forms of social media. The Labor Forum has its own Twitter, and we have our own Facebook page, and of course our website, wrfglaborforum.org. All the many ways we hope that we are connecting with you, giving you an opportunity to comment and give us suggestions and any other ideas about how this program can be improved. We're going to start today, Monday, January 4th, with the labor headlines and then move into Paul's This Week in Labor History. And we have some great guests coming on later. Larry Pelligrini, who often is on other programs here at WRFG, and since the Georgia General Assembly is coming into session a week from today on the 11th, we've all come to fear what those people do at the Gold Dome. We're going to get a little bit of an idea of some of the legislation that might be pending, both good and bad. So here are our labor headlines. I have to tell you all that I scoured international labor news today, and I really didn't find anything that was all that interesting, I have to say, or compelling. And so I think actually my second story on what's happening locally also covers an international perspective. So I'm going to start with this national story. On January 1st, 2016, the minimum wage in 14 states was raised, the result of thousands of low-wage workers organizing, going on strike, and holding countless protests, and more importantly, creating a mass movement for economic justice. Those states are Alaska, Arkansas, California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nebraska, New York, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, and West Virginia. The states of California and Massachusetts have the current highest minimum wage pay scale at $10 an hour. Arkansas raised its rate from $7.50 to $8, and South Dakota from $8.50 to $8.55. In addition, beginning in July 2016, Maryland and D.C. will increase their minimum wage. In stark contrast, only Georgia and Wyoming's state minimum wage of $5.15 is less than the federal rate of $7.25. I really feel that's important to repeat. Almost all the states have either a $7.25 or higher minimum wage except for Georgia and Wyoming, and they both are at $5.15. Plus, in addition to those states I mentioned, 14 cities and counties approved a $15 minimum wage phased in over multiple years. In Seattle, the minimum wage now ranges between $10.50 and $13 an hour, depending on the size of the company. As well, some 24 companies and schools established $15 minimums, such as Facebook, Google, Nationwide Insurance, and the University of California. It is estimated that over 3 million workers are paid $7.25 an hour. Many of them are women, people of color, youth, and older workers who often work irregular shifts and are forced to have 2 or more jobs. The federal minimum wage has not been adjusted in over 6 years, despite large increases in the cost of living. Many more states and counties and cities are expected to raise the minimum wage in 2016. The struggle for economic justice for all workers is far from finished, but the brave and determined low-wage workers and their many supporters deserve much respect and appreciation for taking on this issue and, of course, winning. Now, just prior to the Christmas holidays, the Department of Homeland Security announced a program of mass deportations directed at those mostly women and children who entered the country after January 2014. In the pre-dawn hours of January 2nd, that's just this past Saturday, ICE, Immigration and Customs agents, barged into homes in metro Atlanta and seized 40, perhaps as many as 50, women and children from their beds. The youngest child taken is reported to be 4 years old. By nightfall Saturday, activists with the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights said they believed that they had already been sent by plane to Texas for deportation. The people being targeted by ICE are among the thousands of Central Americans who crossed into the U.S. over the last 2 years, seeking refuge from unchecked gang violence and state repression in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Upon entering the U.S., many turned themselves in immediately to border guards requesting asylum. A story from Norcross, Georgia, reported in the LA Times, provides a look into this inhumane Department of Homeland Security campaign. And I want to just make a comment. I got this information from a story in the LA Times. I saw not one word of these raids in Atlanta media on Sunday, or even today. Saturday morning, the home of Joanna Gutierrez was raided by armed men who arrived in an unmarked car. Agents responded to her request for a warrant before entering her residence, declaring they didn't need one. They checked every room, waking her children and causing them to shake in fear. Despite first claiming they were looking for a man Gutierrez didn't know, they then seized Ana Lizette Mejia, Gutierrez's niece, and her 9-year-old son. In the summer of 2014, following the murder of her brother by gangs in Honduras, she and her child fled to the U.S. seeking safety. While her paperwork was being processed, Mejia wore an ankle monitor and attended all her court dates, according to Gutierrez. ICE has refused to give any information as to the whereabouts or status of Ana Lizette Mejia and her son. Around the world, tens of millions of people from dozens of countries risk great danger to flee from the daily terror of war, unrelenting fear, hunger, and misery, rape and torture at the hands of gangs and paramilitaries and government repression. International law requires countries grant them safe haven. Working class solidarity requires that we demand an end first to this callous campaign against these refugees, and then take all steps to change the U.S. trade and military policies that led to the destabilization and destruction of their home countries. That concludes our headlines for today, Monday, January 4th, 2016, and we'll move right on to Paul's history.
Thanks, Diane. We start the new year with a story which takes us back to the origins of this country as a settler colony. The role of white supremacy is still central in understanding not only the past and the founding of the United States, but also current events in both this country's domestic and foreign policy. On January 3rd, 1895, 19 leaders of the Hopi people were forcibly removed from Arizona and incarcerated on Alcatraz Island, the site of the first fortress and military prison on the West Coast. In a genocidal effort to weaken Hopi family and clan relations and traditional social structure, the U.S. government attempted to move the people off their northern Arizona mesas onto individual allotments of land. In conjunction with this, the Hopis were also ordered to turn over their children, some as young as 5 years old, to government authorities. The children were then taken to boarding schools many miles from home. Reports of the children being beaten for speaking their native language, practicing their religion, and other such infractions of boarding school rules were common. These policies were designed to limit Hopi sovereignty and facilitate settler colonialism. In 1887, the government established a boarding school and pressured parents from the Hopi tribe to enroll their children. When most parents refused to part with their children voluntarily, the government resorted to force, sending soldiers to round up children and send them to the school. At the same time, tensions were rising regarding the limited land that the government had allotted to Native American tribes. In October 1894, for example, 50 Hopi returned to plant on land that had traditionally belonged to them. Rather than continue to round up the children, the U.S. government chose to order troops to arrest the Hopi leaders. They were charged with sedition for opposing the U.S. government's program of forced education and assimilation. Traveling by foot, horse, train, and boat, the Hopi men arrived in San Francisco more than a month later. The terms of their confinement on Alcatraz dictated that they were to be, quote, held in confinement at hard labor until they shall show they fully realize the error of their evil ways, and until they shall evince in an unmistakable manner a desire to cease interference with the plans of the government for the civilization and education of its Indian wards. On Alcatraz, sanitation was deplorable. There was insufficient ventilation, and the building was considered a fire trap. Hardships were suffered by family members back in Arizona as well. Wives of 2 of the prisoners gave birth to children who died during their father's incarceration, and prisoners were separated from their families during important ceremonies and planting and harvesting. After almost 7 months on the cold and damp island, far from their high desert pueblos, the 19 men were released on August 7th and returned to Hopi land. Indian agency and military reports clearly indicate that the people of the Hopi nation maintained their resistance to Washington's policies. In 1995, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office began a project to record the history of the Alcatraz prisoners. Today, the Hopi tribe continues to work to preserve traditional ways and culture.
Thank you very much, Paul. I always say that we always learn so much from your this week in labor history. There's so many elements of U.S. history and the history of so many countries that people are, I think, very deliberately kept ignorant of here in the United States, so that we don't have an idea about the huge backlog of misdeeds and crimes and just atrocities.
And taking children in the middle of the night is not the first time.
Not the first time. We're going to have a short message from WRFG. We're going to come back with our co-host Ayanna Dunlop-Bell and our guest today, Larry Pelligrini. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Labor Forum. This is Diane Mathowitz. We've been joined by Ayanna Dunlop-Bell, who is another co-host here. And of course, we had Paul at the very beginning of the show introduce Paul McLennan. We actually now have 3, and hopefully we're going to have 4 co-hosts here at the Labor Forum as we go into 2016. We're hoping that Tamika Atkins is going to be able to figure out a schedule with her newborn little girl, Olivia. She is so cute. And so Ayanna and Tamika will take turns being here every other Monday, hopefully. So I mentioned at the beginning of the program that we have Larry Pelligrini in the studio, and the reason we invited Larry, and I called him the people's lobbyist when I sent out the announcement, is that, and Larry and I, when we were talking on the telephone in preparation for this, I asked him, how long has it been since we first knew each other? And it turns out that the date of when Larry first started going to the General Assembly and kind of keep track of all those shenanigans that go on under the Gold Dome is the same time that we first met. 25 years ago, let's say it's today.
Close enough, close enough.
25 years ago today. Anyway, so for many of you who listen to some of the other programs here on WRFG, you may have also heard Larry before. Larry has been such a helpful, informative person for so many different groups that are trying to see really what is going on with the legislature here in Georgia. Over all these many years, he keeps track of mountains of information. He brought into the studio a multi-page listing of potential legislation that might come before the Georgia Assembly. I don't know that we're going to have time to go over all of it, but we're going to try our best. So welcome.
We will not, I can tell you, you're right.
So welcome to the Labor Forum, Larry.
Thanks, good to be here, good to be
Is
here.
this the first time you've been on this show?
It is for the Labor Forum, yeah.
Yeah, well, we're gonna try to make up on that.
Well, Mondays are usually my toughest day to schedule.
Well, then we lucked out today.
Yeah.
And then starting next week, you're in the trenches.
A week from today, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about this. There has been limited information that has been in the Atlanta newspapers about some of the so-called initiatives or ideas that the governor has, particularly in relation to what's called merit pay for teachers. We've heard some stuff about RFRA, which is this so-called Religious Freedom Act. And there's been some information about the bill that didn't make it through last year, and then a revised one that's even worse. Those are really the only things that I've seen. So let's talk about those two first, if you don't mind. What is it that the governor thinks merit pay for teachers will do, besides drive teachers out of the state?
Well, before I even get a warm-up, you're gonna force me to be cynical. I think it's an election year move. In all these years, this is probably the most unpredictable from the standpoint of what I've seen, either, or including what we hear in advance. Although there are a lot of pre-file bills, that's sort of normal for an election year. They like to grandstand. And then the challenge is figuring out, once they do introduce something, is it going to be for real or just to grandstand?
For sure.
Yeah. And we've got the additional element this year of something else that I haven't seen before, the Republican presidential primary and the emergence of the, hugely fascist Trump.
And Cruz and
the
others.
The others aren't any better, but the pattern in the past usually has been when a candidate goes to an extreme, the others will sort of divide up other territory. They don't all flock to the extreme, and that's what we've seen this time. Pretty much the contenders are flocking there. So, I see a lot of grandstanding. I see a lot of maneuvering that's going to be going on. I think the governor does want to split teachers. It worked once before when Roy Barnes was running, to have education issues split the professional educators. And I think that's part of it, because I don't think legislators took this throwing out of the idea that has no details yet as one that would be easily workable. There are no standards. Tomorrow at a meeting of progressive groups that I'll be at, GAE, the Georgia Association of Educators, will be there, and I expect them to be hugely fierce on this, as well as the public vote that's coming up next November that has had little publicity. The school takeover bill, what they call the Opportunity School Districts bill. And, it's the only opportunity for, sort of kids for cash. It's sort of turn state money over to private entities. But to set the climate for the issues is that all the Republican candidates, because of the March 1st primary, will be here campaigning every day, setting fires while they're in session. Those who have signed on with a campaign are going to want to help their candidate. We're going to see a lot of bills just as a result of something that they said off the cuff, a candidate says off the cuff. So climate's going to be quite volatile. And so you can name a topic, and my first inclination is to tell you about the bad news, because I also have seen the Democratic caucuses want to distinguish themselves from some of this extremism and to try to correct some of the bad bills of the last couple of years. So I think they're going to have a package that is going to show how they are so different than the Republican ideology of governing.
Paul, you have your
Hand up.
hand up.
We've heard a lot about ALEC, the Legislative Exchange Council. Can you put in context the role they're playing, briefly maybe nationally, but particularly what are they doing here?
Well, Georgia happens to have, from my last tally, the highest number of elected officials of any state as members of that.
Oh my
And-
God, I shouldn't be surprised, but my
right.
mouth just dropped.
Right. And many of them in chairman positions of committees. And of course, the committees at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, have come under a lot of scrutiny in the last couple of years for their favoritism of corporate written bills. But they passed them around. They've had some of their membership not like the bad publicity, the scrutiny of the last couple of years, pull out. But that doesn't mean that they've quit. And they also have a little brother coming now. It's the American City County Exchange. So they're moving to the other level. They have huge amount of money, despite the corporation big dues that were paid to be a part of all of the ALEC stuff. They still have plenty of money. And they pass around what they call cookie cutter model bills. And they see where they can get traction.
For example,
They caught the most flack for the Stand Your Ground in Florida, and then it's spread its evil wings in other places. But they are hugely libraried with things that will help corporations. The corporations sit on these committees, they tell legislators what would be good for them, and then it becomes a bill that can be passed around. The language sometimes, embarrassingly, is not even changed by legislators. They're so eager to favor ALEC and the corporate interest that they just drop the bill in, and it has other states' names in there and things like that, and it's like so obvious, but pathetic. And to go back to Diane's mentioning of not reading a whole lot of stuff in the paper so far, I always want to make the point when people are listening to hook up with an organization that you trust, who monitors the legislative session, to get your information, because I can be at the Capitol one day, something happened, read about it the next morning in the paper and say, that's not right, I was there, that's not right. So if you want to be, and the best defense is to be informed, if you want to be informed, hooked up with a group you trust.
I still want to go back to how would, you said that they haven't got the details worked out, but how would merit pay actually work for a teacher when a teacher in math is not the only teacher that teaches a child. And then so how would an art teacher or a phys ed teacher or I don't know, so many other teachers where maybe in a math you could actually do a test, and if somebody doesn't know that 2 and 2 is 4 and other things, you could say, well, they don't have a grasp of the material. But how in art, how does that
Well,
even work? So it doesn't work. And it doesn't, there's no way that teachers could be fairly, objectively determine that their particular skills contributed to a student's academic growth, in my opinion. Isn't
Well,
that the big dilemma?
It is.
So it's all going to come down to favoritism or some other kind of?
As it often does. And I think that from the vagueness of the idea thrown out by the governor, he wants to leave it in the lap of legislators. When they micromanage the school system curriculum or whatever that they've dabbled in the past, it's a disaster. But no, they would be charged. I believe what he wants to do is turn it over to them to do the formula for it, and yes, they will be picking winners and losers. And ironically, after the governor's statement, a study just came out where there are some incentives currently in place for math and science teachers, and they haven't worked. Hasn't been what they thought it was going to be. So they're going to be looking at, and my first guess, it'll be like a roller coaster. There'll be different disciplines that they'll talk about, and there'll be committee hearings, and they'll come up with some idea, and then there'll be some pressure from another area, and it'll flip.
So hopefully, this whole idea is going to go down in flames.
I think this is going to, number one, be a short session, which they've pretty much said, probably mid-March instead of mid-April or early April, because they can't accept money while they're in session, and it's election year.
Legally, apparently.
But I think they're gonna try to be putting their finger to the wind, and if they don't know what the outcome of an issue will be with the public, for instance, on merit pay. If they don't know, they might just talk about it all session and not actually do anything. And that could apply to several other issues, except for like immigration and gay people and guns. There are some things that they don't care about what the general public thinks.
Ayana, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. So I'm looking at the criminal justice
Yes.
fix that you have here. So can you kind of explain to me about the safety zones? Or so these are things that are already in place elsewhere?
No. This is just the things that we heard that they are thinking about. Charlotte had
North Carolina.
North Carolina had proposed, and of course, as a neighboring state, they test things out. Had talked about establishing safety zones where people who have been arrested can be banned from. And we've had banishment on an unofficial basis in Georgia. And an attempt to codify that could be on the table. This is just something that I was going to talk about, is what we're hearing. And also, Texas has had a big business going with privately funded prosecutions, where like insurance companies will say, to a prosecutor, if you take this case on, if you indict this person, we haven't been able to get them to settle, we'll pay for the prosecution.
Wait, I'm sorry.
You heard that correctly.
That's Texas,
Wait.
though.
Right, but
Well,
don't you
Texas.
think they're looking at that here? Because we've heard that an attempt to codify something like that would not be difficult at all. All they have to do is make it permissive legislation to allow it, not prohibit it.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Go
So
back.
what you said was, if I can't get Paul, say to settle, I would say to the prosecutor who works for the government
Mm-hmm.
that I will pay to have this person indicted?
Pay,
How do you
pay,
bypass?
pay the cost of the legal operation.
Okay.
All right, as we
And-
all
I'm sorry.
gasp
And it
here.
exists, yeah,
Yeah,
it
it
exists.
exists.
Well, there's a lot to gasp over, and some of these things are distractions. They're things that are on the wish list of the corporations, but they don't get. But you still have to spend your time fighting like heck down there, because you don't know where it's gonna go.
And then while people's attention are on something that's so incredibly egregious that you can't even comprehend that somebody would have the nerve to try to do it, something else gets slipped
Lose
through.
focus. Yeah.
So I want to
Yeah.
ask about anything that has to do with workers' rights. I want to know whether there's anything that somebody has dropped impacting either unemployment, compensation, workers' comp, anything else to do with the ability of workers to, vote for a union, get dues check off, any of those kinds of things. Is there anything on that?
Every year there is, really. Either there's the threat of amending another bill, and you get some bills that are really obvious. Like a couple of years ago, the anti-picketing bill. That was obvious because a legislator had been targeted himself. But you get amendments slipped into other bills. The way things work down there at the Capitol is if you have an issue area, a bill is written, they call it the code section. Anything in that code section could be amended onto the bill. So you have some code sections that are very broad, so you have, very, what we might think are not germane, but it was set up to be
To be loosey-goosey.
acceptable. To be loosey-goosey, yeah. It's like the budget, there are very few legislators who actually do the budget. The rest of them just sort of play around the edges. And for the bills, generally the committee chairs can say yes or no. They can control a piece. So if you get a committee chair and a committee member who wants to do an amendment to agree, it can be slipped in. They'll figure out a way that you won't find out about it until it's too late. You walk into a committee hearing and they will have a committee substitute, and you prepared testimony on a 15-page bill, and it's totally different when you walk in. It really is a rotten system. It took hundreds of years to put together. It's not going to change overnight, but it's scary, and people get hurt in the meantime. But we can't give up. I've seen enough little things happen, but we've got to change the players. And it's not all partisan. I mean, not every Democrat is great, and
Heavens
et
no.
cetera.
No.
Can you talk about the trend for, I don't know how far back we want to go, toward privatizing the public sector, whether it be charter schools, MARTA, all the attempts that are made, or this prosecution thing is another example.
You're right.
It seems as though,
Private roads too.
yeah,
Private
it's,
roads.
and prisons.
Private
And
prison
prisons.
industry is the
Yeah,
biggest.
and it seems like everything is moving in that direction.
And another thing I put on the list that people probably hadn't heard, Missouri had a private police forces authorized. So that's something I think that's on their minds now because it's happened somewhere else. You had a clear signal, I think, from Governor Deal that he was going to be most proud, most pleased if we were the business-friendly state of all time during his administration. And he has worked diligently to fulfill that goal. Anything that the corporations want is sort of everybody's falling all over themselves to try to find a way to do it. And privatization is the most lucrative stuff. You know, you know, when you do some of the criminal justice reforms, which to their credit they opened up that topic, it was for the wrong reason. It was because they couldn't afford the prisons anymore, even with privatizing. So, you know, I hope we can get some more little things, but we have to take those, like I said, even if it's for the wrong reason, is what we can get. The Family Leave Act probably can move forward if there are just a couple of more votes shaken loose.
Explain what that is.
That's really a weaker version of federal law that in this case would have people not lose their jobs.
Right, they don't get paid
Yeah,
while they're out.
they don't get paid, so that's
they
the
pay.
main definition of weaker.
But it would be recognized that people sometimes have to take off work for a
Right.
sick parent, sick child.
Right, it's
themselves.
not just the person and their employer having an arrangement, but the person and employer having an arrangement to acknowledge the family needs and not lose your job, period. So it is important, and even though it's not everything that was wanted by the coalition, who's worked for years on this. They have had committee hearings, which doesn't always happen with a decent bill. They get buried. And they've had a bipartisan support. But companies don't want legislators to regulate anything about them. They don't want a minimum wage. Not in our lifetime, my dear.
Don't say that. Do not say that. Because I just
well, I was
did the
gonna say-
report, 515 in Georgia. There's only one other state in the whole United States that has a 515
And Alabama
state.
doesn't even have a.
Yeah, there's several states that don't have one at all.
But you
But
know,
if they have one, only Wyoming and Georgia,
But you-
515.
you know when we moved from 225 to
515?
515?
No, what year?
No, what was that?
1999, 2000 session. And it had been 30 years before that it was 225.
Okay,
So I was saying, I was gonna say,
I'm not going to agree with that in my lifetime.
well, I
Fight, fight, fight.
I had a tagline there until we changed the players. And the demographics of Georgia are changing in the progressive favor. True. And everybody recognizes that. The problem right now, that in my estimation, is that those who know that the days are numbered are going to do everything they can while they've got the numbers.
And suppress the vote. That's the other thing they do.
That is something that's been a long-term, successful way to have
Like the voter
have
ID.
power.
Right.
Yeah.
Because what I was going to say, I was watching, I forget which one of the shows, and and they said that there are 15 states now that have anti-voting laws in place, that will be in place for the election season coming up. Okay, I guess I get a little lost in that part, because those same kind of suppressions, they've already been trying to, like you say, screw with voter ID and you know, residency, any and everything they can touch. So how right now the new legislation that was passed, that's going to be in for this election season, how does that affect, or how do you think or see it affecting what happens with our own legislation here in Georgia?
Well, last year they left on the table, in a deal with the Black Caucus, that school takeover bill required a 2/3 vote. And there were Republican defectors, so it wasn't all partisan, and they needed Democrat votes. So there were a couple members of the Black Caucus who did vote in favor of putting that on the ballot. Some said they just wanted people to vote, others actually believe in charter schools getting more than their fair share of public money and not having to account for it, not having to be accountable. And things that they left on the table because of that deal was not passing restrictions on early voting, further shrinking. They've already done that, but further shrinking that. And the League of Women Voters deserves a lot of credit for marshaling the forces to hold off on that. One thing that, unless you follow the minutiae of the Secretary of State's office, you also see him maneuvering in interpretation of voting law. He has moved also to, and he's a supposed candidate for governor after Deal. He has moved to eliminate precincts, and I don't know who is monitoring those. I see some lists where they propose every month to close a precinct, and I wonder where is that? And there are 5 of us in this room, we could all guess, probably well. I just don't know for a fact, and I don't know who's really monitoring that. So I think there are insidious things like that. The voter ID bill from a couple of years ago was a devastating blow, and that came down to like 1 vote difference, a walkout. And that was a partisan vote in both the House and the Senate, strictly partisan. But the Democrats walked out, it was so bad. And what the press covered was the picture ID. And there were so many other things in there, like accepting some colleges' IDs as acceptable for voting and others not. And guess which ones those were?
Of course.
The historically black colleges, no, they wouldn't accept theirs. Yeah.
We have like 10 minutes left or something, and so because this has been was such a hot button issue last year, I think we got to talk about
And
religious freedom.
Yeah.
Restoration Act.
The so-called religious freedom, yeah. You know, last year, there was a tremendous, almost model opposition form, it's got to be greater this year because it's got to overcome the election year politics. Senator McCoon has introduced, you know, a lot of hot button stuff, so he's going to be kept real busy. But he loves to get in front of the camera, so the hotter the opposition, the more you're going to see of him. We've heard that although his bill from last year passed out of the Senate, now he's a committee chairman, so he could get it out of his chamber because he can hold legislation for votes. Isn't that terrible?
Yeah, he's got.
And I can't prove that he did it since I'm being filmed. But as a committee chairman, you know, he can say, well, your bill isn't going to move. So he passed it out of the Senate. He doesn't have that same pull in the House. He was outmaneuvered in committee where they attached a non-discrimination amendment to it. And the House is not a big fan of Senator McCoon's opportunism. He's considered a candidate for Attorney General or maybe even Lieutenant Governor. So they're not quite as loyal as the senators. So I think that is going to be a battle in that committee that stalls out again. The person who was a Republican who added the the anti-discrimination amendment went on to be a judge. So he left his position. The person who replaced him was a Democrat who campaigned against RFRA. Clearly the people voted for him knowing that. And instead of appointing a Republican to replace a Republican on that committee, they replaced, it was Representative Jacobs who became the judge. They replaced Representative Jacobs with a Democrat. That is something that that might tell you something. In his back pocket, though, we understand that the Speaker of the House has a compromise, so-called, the Pastor Protection Act. And that would merely mirror federal law, so it really is not necessary. But if they feel it's politically expedient,
throw a bone.
they'll vote for anything. Even if the state's attorneys say it's unconstitutional, they still could vote for it down there for a bill. But there also is another version that a senator has almost ready. I have not seen the language, but we understand it's almost ready. That would allow people to respond based on their conscience if they claim religious freedom. So, and it can be public workers and all that in Georgia. And the danger, I think, of that one is this fresh meat. It's a senator who doesn't have much of, he's I think only in his second term or maybe even his first, who doesn't have much of a reputation on the House side and probably has been working this, to be able to do that. So if they feel they have to pass this for political reasons, they meaning the elected majority down there, then they have somewhere to go with the extreme. I think we're strong enough and smart enough to outmaneuver them again.
I want to ask about immigration at the end, because we did just have this report about the federal government swooping in and taking people who definitely have a legitimate claim to asylum status, refugee status. Georgia ranks among some of the worst in the country for anti-immigration legislation. Is there anybody who's trying to still do something else?
Well, actually, yes, and I'm gonna directly blame this on Trump because I saw from the bad Arizona copycat bill 3 years ago, or 4 years ago now, that legislators sort of backed away from the heavy-handed, mean-spirited stuff. And last year, they actually had a vote, and they voted to allow the DACA, the Dreamers, deferred action students to keep their driver's licenses. Now, I think the mood has changed. I think there are legislators who let that go and backed away from it, maybe thinking of the future, demographic changes. But I think that's changed and it's very volatile. We have the English-only bill now,
Oh, right.
which is going to be a constitutional amendment. There is a proposal to have what we're calling the scarlet letter driver's license. If you can't keep these dreamers from getting a license, then you put a scarlet letter on it, and the proposal, and it is posted on a website of the person pushing it, it actually says illegal alien on it. The bill last year that included the taking away of the driver's license is going to be rewritten. And one of the problems with that bill, people didn't hear much about, it required the collection of biometrics and DNA from everybody who was getting a driver's license. They knew it would be unconstitutional to do just one segment, so that wasn't real popular. So we understand that's going to be taken out. Governor Deal rescinded his refugee mean-spirited executive order.
On food stamps?
Yes, he
Oh, when did
rescinded
that
that,
happen?
he
Today.
rescinded that
Oh,
today,
today.
yes.
Well,
He said
after he was
the
told
lawyer
by
said that they couldn't, yeah,
the
you
Attorney
could not
General
do it.
says, you're
Can't do
so
it."
full of it.
Yeah,
I think that there will be some grandstanding, but may not pass, things like calling for, they won't pass as bills, they could be resolutions, which don't have the force of law, to oppose birthright citizenship and Obama's executive orders, you know, just things that they would urge the congressional delegation to do so they can go on record as being anti-immigrant, ready for the next election, because they think that still is valuable to them.
And no Medicaid expansion.
And they are gonna call it that. You
But
can
they
have,
might
you,
figure something else out.
yes,
There's pressure.
there's huge pressure, and they'll call it closing the coverage gap.
Thank you, Larry Pelligrini. Thank you so much for being here. I know that Paul, Ayana, and I hope all of the listeners really learned a lot. We are definitely bringing you back. I
Okay.
want to thank everyone for listening, watching, tuning in today. We'll be back again next Monday. Thank you so much, and please stay tuned to the next program here on WRFG, which is Democracy Now!